Mr. Speaker, as we've been discussing, often grassroots organizations are born not out of necessity, or are actually born out of necessity, not only because the system has not worked for them oftentimes, but sometimes because the system has been created, has been reorganized, or is actively fighting against them. Virgin Islanders understand the importance and the value of grassroots organizations. It's our nature, our lifeblood. We are a small people on a small island who have a history that was born out of oppression. And so the very need for grassroots organization and people who are resilient and willing to resist and fight in a passionate manner has been our very nature. Our first experience with grassroots organizations was in 1733 on the island of St. John in the Virgin Islands, which is probably the first slave uprising in the Western Hemisphere, where a group of 150 slaves decided that they had had enough, and those Aquanu slaves of Ghana decided that they were going to throw off the shackles of rebellion and organize themselves in a manner. And they were so effective at it, Mr. Speaker, that they were able to hold the island of St. John for 6 months against the Danish government. The Danes had to organize in such a manner that they brought the French and the Swiss government to provide assistance to them. And the slaves of St. John were quelled after that rebellion. But it took a grassroots group of organized individuals to be able to do that. Again, in July 3rd, of 1848. Many people don't know that the Virgin Islands became the second place in the Western Hemisphere to receive emancipation after Haiti. We did that in July 3rd, 1848, through the work of General Butteux, but what people do not know is that John Butteux had an enormous organizational group that plotted and planned for months before the actual staging of that uprising, which was so effective and so organized that when they went to storm the fort against an armed militia, the militia didn't realize that all of the cannons, the gunpowder had been taken out and had been replaced with molasses. The slaves were so organized and so quiet and kept to themselves so much that they didn't even realize that it had been done. The governor of Denmark that was assigned to the Virgin Islands had to sign the emancipation on that date because he knew that these group of people were so organized that that rebellion could take the entire island out. And so we received our emancipation earlier than the African Americans received theirs through that organization of grassroots. Again, in 1878, in October, the slaves had been moved not from slavery, just slavery, to an organized serfdom where there were contracts that had to be, labor contracts that had to be signed. People were oppressed and living in what many here would understand as a sharecropping system, but was really a serf system. 4 women organized a labor rebellion at that time, which we in the Virgin Islands called the Fire Burn. They were willing to burn the islands down for just wages for themselves and laborers throughout the islands. They forced the signed contracts to have much better wage laws in them, much better terms in them for individuals. Those women were imprisoned, sent to Denmark, many of them burned at the stake for that rebellion. But it was grassroots organizations that were able to do that. More recently, in the 1950s, there was the creation of the Virgin Islands Labor Union, the organizing of cane workers and field workers. I'm proud to say that my own uncle Raymond Plaskett was one of the organizers of that. They were able to force the sugar plantation owners, the sugar industry to sit down and create unionized collective bargaining labels. But we would be remiss as a people if we kept that organizational skills to ourselves, and we've brought that to the United States as well. Many people know about Denmark Vesey, who organized slave rebellions in South Carolina. He did that as a free man, coming from the Virgin Islands and understanding that oppression anywhere of anyone was an oppression of himself, and gladly laid down his life, gave up his freedom to help organize the people of South Carolina, Charleston, where my great colleague James Clyburn represents, to bring freedom to those individuals. Hubert Harrison from the island of St. Croix was one of a civil rights activists, was the mind of Pan-Africanism, along with Edward Blyden of St. Thomas, who gave form and shape to Marcus Garvey and his organizing and his Back to Africa movement. And more recently, Roy Innis, another relative of mine, who was one of the leaders of CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality. Stokely Carmichael, Malcolm X, all people of the Caribbean who have come to the United States who recognize that grassroots organizations must be formed to push for equal rights. The accomplishments of the Civil Rights Movement have given us much: created momentum of the Civil Rights Act, Brown versus Board of Education, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, ended housing discrimination, desegregation of schools, democratic political gains, and the March on Washington. But we have organized groups still growing today because equality has not come to its full fruition in America. There's still income equality, achievement gaps, poverty, unemployment, increase in the use of for-profit prisons that have incarcerated Black men disproportionately. And because of that, we have seen other movements now today. Black Lives Matter, founded in 2012 after the death of Trayvon Martin. Moral Mondays, which began in April 2013 by the Reverend William Barber of Greenleaf Christian Church in Goldsboro, North Carolina, after the governor's mansion was taken over and the state legislature related to voting rights. These are injustices that are continuing today that African Americans and others are standing up for, whether it be Standing Rock, the Muslims ban, the March on Washington, or the grassroots group Indivisible, which has grown with African American and others, which stood with their constituents at recent town halls to make sure that their congressmen and women hear their voices on all issues of importance. With that, Mr. Speaker, we understand that the people of all of the United States need to understand the importance of grassroots organizations as we end our Black History Month. Congressman Vesey, this has been an outstanding time for Congress as well as the people of America to hear about the grassroots organizations and how they may close. And with that, Mr. Speaker, both of us, I believe, at this time will yield back to you the time. We are asking that the record stay open. There is a statement from the great Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson, and that it may stay open for others to put in their statements.
The gentlewoman's request will be handled by generally. Gentlelady yields back.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, we yield back at this time.
All right. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2017, the Chair recognizes the gentleman.